You have heard the word agile used in athletic and project and software environments, but what about leadership? What does it mean to be an agile leader? And that's a big question. That is the big question for us today. Welcome to another live episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. If you're listening to this podcast, you could have listened to us live with folks from literally all around the world and gotten this information, in this case, about 6 weeks sooner. So you can get access to all future live episodes and find out when and how they're happening by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn. Today's episode is brought to you by Remarkable Leadership Sessions. Remarkable Development Sessions are webinars for a new world, a world where people want to learn the latest ideas and powerful techniques, but want to learn together. We all know that we learn from interaction with others, but in this fractured, increasingly virtual world, the workshop experience has been shifted to a focus on delivering the content and leaving the application to you as an individual. And even if you love learning from webinars, you've probably thought there's got to be a better way, and we believe we've found it. Introducing Remarkable Development Sessions. You can learn more by going to kevineikenberry.com/remarkable development to learn more and register for an upcoming session on a valuable skill. And with that, I'm going to add Chuck Mollor to our feed, and I'm going to introduce him to you quickly. And Chuck, make sure I say your last name for me so I get it perfect.
Sure, it's Mollor.
Mollor.
Yes.
I got it. Chuck Mollor is the founder, CEO, and chief executive coach at MCG Partners, an organization that helps develop leaders and teams, optimizing both businesses and individual talent. His new book, The Rise of the Agile Leader, Can You Make the Shift?, is a guide for the aspiring mid and seasoned C-level leader and executive that introduces a new leadership paradigm, a roadmap for what it takes and makes to be a great leader and what organizations must do to develop those great agile leaders. And with that, Chuck, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
And so I think we should get started. Let me make this screen the way I want it, like that, so we can see you better.
All right.
So I want to just start with a simple question, one that I know you have an answer to, right? So
Okay.
You didn't wake up at age 6 saying, I'm going to write a book about agile leadership. Tell us a little bit about the journey that leads you to this point.
Wow, that's a long story. I'll try to be as brief as I can. I think, I learned very early in my career in life that I like to solve problems. I like to learn. So I got into management consulting. I was involved in a number of methodologies, process engineering, strategy, managing change. Then I got into the leadership talent management space, and I've been in that space for over 20 years. And in that journey of building practices, running practices, having earlier been a consultant and managing projects and people, I ended up having my own sort of leadership challenges in my journey, right? Trying to understand what leadership is for me. I remember getting a very tough 360 feedback in '99, and my boss, the CEO of the time, said, Chuck, you'll be successful because you care about people, you work hard, you're smart, you get great results. But if you want to be a CEO one day, if you want to get to the next level of leadership one day, you really have to understand leadership and not just the management part of your job. And that was not, of course, something I wanted to hear at the time, but it became a really profound moment in my life and my career to try to figure out what is leadership for me. And that's a question for all of us. Anyone that's in leadership today or striving to be in leadership or want to evolve in their career, advance in their career, they really have to answer that important question. What does leadership mean for myself? Because it's a very personal question, in addition to obviously best practices and methodologies about leadership effectiveness.
Well, that begs the question, because the title of this book is The Rise of Agile Leadership.
Sure.
So it begs the question, though I agree with you that we have to spend some time thinking about that for ourselves and how that will play out for us. It begs the question. You wrote the book. So what is agile leadership, or what does it mean to be an agile leader?
So there's really agile's used in maybe really two different ways. In the business world, agile, at least for the last 20, 30 years, has been referenced to a methodology, or another way of describing a Scrum methodology. It really came out of the software development space where you're trying to develop the next generation of software. So became a methodology to allow software teams to be able to innovate and self-manage at a faster, leaner, more agile way. And in that, especially the last 10 years, agile methodology has really taken off outside of software development. Now, in the book, agile is the verb, so I actually struggled about whether I was going to use that word because it's so often used in again, software development now in business in terms of agile teams, agile methodology in terms of innovation and cycles of innovation and shortening those cycles of innovation. But it's also about how do we become more effective in how we either self-manage or manage on a more flatter, empowered decision-making way. Now, the nice thing about my book and also the methodology we created around agile leadership, it fits that methodology very nicely as well. So it's not just limited to the verb itself. But the reason we came up with this title, Kevin, is because I asked the question a few years ago, what's the future of leadership? Leadership has been changing dramatically. Now, this is pre-COVID, right? So we could think about how much it's accelerated, since COVID. But before COVID, leadership has been changing dramatically. Again, innovation being a big focus of how cycles of innovation are getting shorter, the pressure, the stress of not only competing globally, but also competing in a .com environment, in an Amazon environment, not only on the consumer level, but also obviously B2B as well. The demand and interests of something new and different are getting faster and more competitive than ever. And then you factor in the competition and the landscape and how innovation impacts is not just the demand of consumers and clients and decision makers, but look at all the litany of companies that don't exist anymore. 10 years from now, companies we thought that were the best at their breed in terms of what they were offering the marketplace. And if you look at even the Fortune 500, half the Fortune 500 doesn't exist from like 15 years ago. So the impact it has to business and your success, whether you're a Fortune 500 mid-size startup, it's really impactful. So we came from the perspective is what do leaders need to really do to be effective in the world today when you think about not only innovation, but the pressures of managing a multi-generational workforce, probably more generations in the workforce we've ever captured before. How do we deal with the demands of the new generation? And how do we deal with, and again, virtual hybrid workforce existed before COVID, obviously accelerated completely after COVID and during COVID. So there's multiple things that really impacted why leadership need to be seen differently, starting as recently as 5 years ago.
So early in the book, you have a line. I'm going to read it, and then if you want to comment on it further, it sort of summarizes some of what you just said and maybe expands on it a little bit. And you wrote, the Agile leader has the ability and capacity to assess risk soundly, decide courageously, and act quickly to meet a rapidly changing environment while producing results and developing others' capacity to do the same. Anything you want to add to that point, Chuck?
No, I mean, I think that's a really nice summary. Thank you for quoting that. I really try to move away from what I call the traditional leadership book. A lot of my book really is not only providing a framework of what agile leadership is, what it means, and how to define that, but then really provide a roadmap to help people really personalize that for themselves. Meaning, what are some tools, methodologies, and strategies that one can actually take away and apply for wherever they are in their career and what kind of leader they are today. So that was part of what I was trying to do with the book, is make it as practical as possible for people, and not just to make it completely theoretical. But no, I think that's a great quote. And I mean, there's so many facets to leadership, especially how that's changed the last 2 years. Again, I wrote the book before COVID, so it got published during COVID, but the actual book itself was written before it. The reason I published it during COVID, Kevin, because I really felt that the book was needed during COVID, that people really needed to think about, how do I manage this really incredibly stressful, volatile, world that we're living in right now?
So that answers part of one of the questions that I had. So let me ask a slightly different one, and that is looking forward, right? In what maybe let's call in the post-pandemic times, if you will. What do you know now that maybe isn't in the book, or that you wish you would have talked about more when you were writing it, a couple of years
Yeah,
ago?
I think that's a really great question because I talk about two things in the book that frankly probably require much more emphasis in today's world. And moving forward, to your point, Kevin, one is around this concept around psychological safety, or I like to refer to as creating a safe work environment. And we're not talking safety in terms of physical safety. We're really talking about safety in the sense of, are you creating a work environment that people feel they can question, they can challenge, they can generate ideas and push back and say no, or I disagree. Part of the challenge today is we're moving so quickly. There's so much pressure to perform, to retain talent. We all heard about the great resignation and the impact of that. But more importantly, for all levels of employees, all generations of employees, are we creating an environment? Are we focusing on an environment where people feel comfortable to challenge? Because at the end of the day, it really comes down to really one thing that's really changed the last 2 years, Kevin. Do people feel appreciated and valued? And appreciated and valued is not just about performance and being an employee and being part of the team. It's also, the mindset they bring to the table, their level of engagement. Do I want to contribute beyond my job description? Can I see my role? Can I see my impact to the organization on a macro level, not just on a micro level? So do we create an environment that really demonstrates that level of appreciation and value? And again, as managers today, it's so hard more than ever because not only the pressure to manage, but a lot of managers to this day are not spending enough time managing. So I would say this whole concept of psychological safety is really, really critical. And then this whole issue of self acceptance and self development. I talk in the book about the two-sided coin, and there's always the emphasis on development. And don't be wrong, that's critical. But so many managers today are they're not spending enough time managing. But part of that is they don't spend enough time creating time for self reflection. They're not taking time to pause. They're not asking themselves, do I accept myself as a leader? Do I accept myself as a person? We don't love and like everything about ourselves, but it's kind of hard to accept the world around us when we're struggling to accept ourselves. So these are topics that we never really historically talked about in the world of leadership. This whole notion of self-acceptance, yeah, that's a whole new paradigm. I think that more and more we're talking in the business world around the world that go beyond just, are you part of our team? How do I get to know you as a person? Are you okay as a person in your environment because of all the mental health and anxiety and issues we've had dealing with children and parents and other things that impact our ability to be successful when we're working hybrid or virtual? So I think those are things that frankly have come out of COVID that are much more important today than they were 2 years ago.
So what on the self-acceptance side of this coin, right?
Right.
What advice do you have for us as leaders to help us be more self-accepting?
Boy, that's a really good and deep question. I think there are a few things. I think that we're just in a world today. We're running 100 miles an hour, and I don't care where you are and how old you are, whether it's activities, interests, hobbies, kids, families, other interests, boards. We just seem to like we're always busy, and then we're not busy. We're involved in some kind of hobbies or we're relaxing, whether it's social media or other media outlets, and there really isn't a lot of self-reflection as much, at least in the world of leadership. I think as for those that are leaders today or wanting to be leaders, and I think this whole notion of self-acceptance, you have to have time to reflect. You have to have time to ask yourself some questions that require to look in the mirror. And for some of us, and look, I was there earlier in my life and my career, and I'm sure a lot of people in your audience probably can relate to this. Sometimes it's really hard to look in the mirror and look deep, look within, understand the experiences that shaped who you are, Kevin. Right. So what's happened to you as you've grown up in your life, in your childhood, in your adult life, that really has had a profound impact. And it's not just impacted you in a way because of the actual experience. It's impacted you in how you deal with things and react to things in your life today and moving forward. So self-acceptance is just beyond, do I like myself? Do I accept myself with all my flaws, my quirks, and my bad habits and the things I don't like about myself? It's also understanding the experiences that really shaped you and why we respond to our environment the way we do. And where is there an opportunity to respond to our environment differently moving forward?
Well, talking about responding differently, let's just take this moment right now. We've got people
Right.
by my count from 4 continents that are with us right now, right? And the odds of that happening even 3 years ago, even though we had literally the technologies we're using right now, we
Mhm.
mostly had 2.5 years ago. The platform you and I are using, certainly the ability for lives to happen on LinkedIn and the other platforms, for example, but to have that sort of reach matters a lot. And now in a world where many are leading and they have team members on all those continents as well, right? So the world is certainly changing. Um, there are lots of people. You mentioned you wanted to write a book that was different than other leadership books. And there are lots of great leadership books that have come up with a phrase or a word in front of the word leader. I wrote a book about remarkable leadership. There are books about servant leadership. There are books,
Yeah.
I mean, name it, right? I had a conversation earlier today with some folks talking about being a more caring leader. You're using the word agile. So my question is agile leadership a style? And if it's not, then what is it?
No, that's a great question. I would say that it's not necessarily a style. I think if you look at our model, which is in the book, it talks about all the attributes, all the characteristics of what makes up an agile leader. It's really about understanding, who am I and how do I think of myself, but also how am I seen? What's my skill set and what behaviors am I demonstrating that reflect this sort of these characteristics, these attributes of being agile? So, one of the questions, and there's an external aspect of that. We talked about already a couple in terms of the work environment we're creating, how we demonstrate appreciation and value. And there's so many other characteristics that go into the agile, leadership framework that I make reference to in this book. I also think the other question is, how, and it goes back to what I said earlier in the very beginning of our conversation, Kevin, which is, are we really spending enough time understanding, our willingness to adapt and change and evolve? Now, I'm not talking about changing who we are. We are who we are. That's not going to change, right? Our core self is never going to be different, but it's our ability to adapt. It's our ability to be situational. It's our ability to evolve and flex our muscles in terms of skills and knowledge and characteristics, so we can be effective not only in situations, we can be effective with people. We can be effective strategically. We can be effective tactically. We can be effective in how we develop and manage teams and all of our key stakeholders, right? Whether if you're a CEO and you're managing your board, you're managing your investors, you're managing Wall Street, you're managing your private equity, your venture capital partner, you're somewhere in your mid-level of your career and you're managing your peers and your bosses. I mean, there's so many attributes, and of course, managing your own people. So I think that's the question: is understanding, am I willing to adapt? Am I willing to still evolve? Am I still curious? Do I feel I've accomplished everything I can, or I've reached the pinnacle of my expertise as a leader? Am I willing to settle at that? I think that's where you've got to start. And then from there, it's being receptive and open to the journey of recognizing that stretching yourself, expanding your capability doesn't compromise your integrity or compromise your authenticity of who you are and your effectiveness as a leader.
So there's a section in the book that immediately caught my eye, and I want us to talk about. And as I'm reflecting on our audience today, I know that this phrase might not really click for people in every part of the world,
Right.
but you talk about something called the secret sauce. So I'll just sort of translate that for folks around the world who might not know what
Right.
we mean by a secret sauce. It's kind of a phrase that's used in the U.S. that sort of
Yes.
says there's something that we got. I mean, before we get to the metaphor, there's something on our sandwich that's no one knows quite what's in it, but it's what makes the sandwich awesome. And so people often call it the secret sauce. And so we talk about the secret sauce. What's the secret sauce of agile leadership?
Well, as you know, the book really kind of provides a framework for that. I'm not going to go through all that. If I had to sort of paraphrase it today,
Well,
and I love
you got to give us some of the ingredients. How about that?
well, I,
Maybe
I,
not
I
the
will. I,
metaphor.
I, I think I've already alluded to a few of them, right? The ability to be curious, the ability to be learned, the willingness to be adaptable, the willingness to be receptive to feedback and input, not just about our ideas and our strategies and our direction and our decisions, but ourselves. One of the things I talk about in the book, and I think it's a big part of what you're discussing. And by the way, anyone that's a cook, anyone you know, and that's my metaphor across the world. Everybody has a special meal they like to make, and they have their secret ingredients. That's the secret sauce, right? So I think what I wanted to be is transparent and say, what's that secret sauce in terms of anyone? I don't care who you are, what part of the world, where you are in your career, what sex you are. It doesn't make a difference. There is a secret sauce, and like most secret sauces, there's multiple ingredients. It's not just one or two things. So anyway, going off from that point, so one of the things I talk about, and I try to give a visual, and I talk about this is for those who are not familiar with surfing. You know, there's a surfer metaphor I use in the book about a surfer on the ocean on a surfboard. And you know, one of the things in life, not just in business, especially today, is the uncharted waters that we're in. Right? And because the ocean, and any of us that's been on the ocean, if you're not near the ocean, we all know that at any given moment, the ocean can change. Right? The waves, the level of the waves, a storm coming through, a wind, a current, rainfall. And the key to navigating in the ocean is your ability to create stability on your surfboard. Frankly, stability in your boat, if you want to use a boat metaphor. So I think one of the secret ingredients is in the world of chaos that we live in today, how do we create stability for ourselves first, but also then the world around us? Because you know, there's always something happening around change, around direction, around restructuring, around innovation, new products, scaling, pulling back. Go through all the scenarios that's happening in business today. So how do we create this sort of foundation of stability in a world of chaos? So that's one of the things I talk about in the book.
There's something that you've mentioned a couple of times here that I want to highlight for people. You've used the word being receptive, and I think that it's often framed for not what you said, but often when people say, "Oh, I'm receptive to the ideas of other people. I'm receptive for us to to collaborate and all that stuff," and I hope that's true. But you hinted at something else that I thought maybe we could talk about very briefly, and
Sure.
that is being receptive to feedback from others. It's different than being receptive to an idea or an approach or whatever. But Chuck, if you're going to give me some feedback, if I'm your leader, then I've got to be receptive to that too. Anything specific you want to say about that? Because I think that one is one that maybe stubs people's toe a little bit more.
I absolutely agree. And then you factor in depending where you live in the world and in your country's culture and the whole concept of how feedback is either provided or given or received. That's a whole nother facet, right? So just to be so much generic and inclusive of any sort of culture, feedback is really, it is one of the secret ingredients because most of us do a really lousy job of it. And it doesn't mean that we don't ask the question. But a couple of things have to happen. How we respond, and frankly, the response is not no response. Most of us get a little defensive. Why? Because there's ego and pride involved, and we feel like we have to justify our behavior, or actions, or decision, or frankly, how we're managing or leading our particular organization or people, or maybe that person. And one of the critical skills of feedback are two things. One is to listen, to be receptive, to be open, to non-judgmental, and frankly, to not respond. Now, you may want to respond on another time once you've had a chance to process and think it through and really reflect, but to really listen. Because here's what happens. If you respond immediately, and especially if there's some defensiveness, and maybe you're not even being defensive, maybe you're trying to just justify what you're doing. What do you think the chances of that person, or frankly, anyone else, once they find out how you responded, they're going to try to give you feedback in the future? And let's face it, we all know, and I don't care how self-aware we are, we just don't have the perception of how others see us. And if we're not asking for feedback, we just don't know how we're coming across. We may have the best intentions in the world, but unless we have people that are willing to give us and have the courage to give us feedback, we just don't necessarily know the impact we're having others. But the other thing that's really critical about feedback is being specific. Most of us simply say, "Hey, I'm receptive to feedback. Can you please give me feedback, Kevin?" Well, most people are going to stare at you with a blank face and say, "Oh my God, I have no idea what this person wants, and how am I supposed to respond?"
Especially when they're my boss. Oh my gosh.
Exactly. So, but a couple of really amazing things happened, Kevin, when you asked for feedback, and a very sincere, authentic, like, I really want you to help me understand how I can be better as a leader. I'm talking especially to your subordinates or to your peers. One, you're telling them you value their opinion. You truly want them and their voice and their opinion of you. The second thing is you're saying, I'm actually open to getting better. Just because I'm your boss or I'm the CEO or I'm somewhere in the or I'm you're managing you, or even as a peer where we're competing maybe for the next succession or promotion, I'm still saying I value your opinion. It's important to me and I want to get better. And again, as I said earlier, be specific. If you're trying to be more effective in how you communicate, if you're being better at trying to delegate more effectively, or asking more questions versus dictating, whatever the area may be specific about it. But I talk about this all the time. Asking for feedback and doing it well is actually one of the most powerful leadership tools we have.
So Robin has done a fabulous job of summarizing what we said, I think. So Robin says Agile leadership is not just for the product owner or the scrum master, but everyone has some kind of secret sauce that they are applying to the sandwich. So I love that. We have someone else that's asked a question. And so I'm going to, before we shift gears and start to finish, I'm
Sure.
going to ask this question from someone on LinkedIn who said, can you give us a recent example of Agile leadership from the news?
That's a really fair question. I honestly can't think of anything recent that really sticks out to me. What I have been asked though is, and I'm going back to the example of creating a safe work environment. One person had once asked me, "Well, Chuck, is there any data that supports, creating this environment, creating a work environment where people really can feel open and receptive and challenging and innovative? I don't care what department you're in. It doesn't make a difference if you're developing products or services, or if you're an operation or an accounting or IT, right? This applies to any department, micro, macro in a company. But so I was asked recently, well, is there any data that supports this actually can work? And if you haven't seen it, there's a Google case study. So you can Google. So Google, the company, actually did some research on this actual question. Their question was, what are the drivers to high performing teams in our company? And they went through a variety of levels of research. If you Google this, you can find the data. And their number one factor that why the high performing teams were creating and producing at Google was around psychological safety.
Yeah, and we're talking about really super smart people. So it wasn't about the science. It wasn't about the technology. It was about something else. I have a couple more questions for you, Chuck, before we wrap up. And again, thank you everyone who's participating and sending in your comments and your thoughts. I'm trying to get most of them on the screen here if we're not using them directly. So, Chuck, what do you do for fun?
Oh boy, I do a lot of things, Kevin, and I try to practice what I preach. So I do try to find time for my own physical, mental, and spiritual health. So I do yoga a couple of times a week. I'm a bit biking person, so I don't like to run anymore because of my knees. I like to play golf. I like to walk and play golf, and not only be with my friends, but also be out there and in the fresh air. I have 4 children, so I like to spend time with my kids as much as possible, even though there are very different stages of life, including engagement and living in other parts of the country. Um, and honestly, this may not be fun to everybody, but I like to pay attention to what are the best practices and what are some of the thought leadership that's out there today and for tomorrow. So I like to stay curious. I like to keep myself informed in terms of what the future is looking like, not just in business, but in life in general. So there's just some small examples for fun.
So, a little inside baseball for all of you. Normally, I have the chance to talk with my guest for a few minutes before we go live, and that wasn't able to happen today, which is fine. But what it leads is me to put Chuck in a situation that he's not going to be aware of, because there's only ever one question I ask that I tell people ahead of time I'm going to ask. So, Chuck, here it is. I hope you're ready. I learned a long time ago that people prefer to know this one ahead. So, here it is. So, Chuck, what are you reading these days? what's something that you've read recently? And you may say, I can't remember the title, but what's something that you either are reading, have read, or would recommend to us?
Yeah, I am starting to read something, and by the way, and the reason we didn't have this conversation because I couldn't make it, so it's my fault, by the way,
Oh,
audience.
no, it's fine.
That was all on me, not you, Kevin. It was one of those Mondays already. So I don't remember the actual author, but it's a relatively new book. It's around joy in leadership, joy in company culture. I think if you just Google the word joy around leadership or culture or business, it's someone coming out of human resources that's written about this whole concept of joy, how we create joy. And my reaction to that is, I think creating an environment where people feel appreciated and valued, but we're also where they're having some fun. And by the way, oh, there you go. Leading with joy.
Is that
Yes,
it?
that is it.
It's magic, everybody, right here
Yeah.
on
Delivering
the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. How about that, everybody? I just had a feeling that might be it. So we'll make sure. So if you didn't see it, the book is called Leading with Joy: Practices for Uncertain Times. And as always, we will have that in the show notes wherever you're watching this podcast. You can get that information. So, or whatever you're watching or listening, if you go back to the source, you can get that. You can always go to remarkablepodcast.com. So now the question, Chuck, you've been waiting. Is Kevin ever going to ask me this question? Where can they learn more about the book and you, and where do you want to point people?
Sure. Well, if you want to learn the book, The Rise of the Agile Leader, Can You Make the Shift? You can find that at a variety of locations, including Amazon and Target and a variety of bookstores, anything online for the most part, as well as in a couple of bookstores in person. If you want to learn more about me or my business, my company, because I am a CEO of a company. I'm actually also a former CEO of a global consulting firm, but you can find more about me at www.mcgpartners.com.
mcgpartners.com. And so now a question for all of you before we wrap up. The question I ask every single episode is, now what? Everybody who's watching and listening, what are you going to do as a result of this? And you heard a bunch of things today that you could go and immediately apply. I won't tell you which ones they should be, but rather encourage you to make sure you figure out what they are for you. Maybe it's about reflecting. Maybe it's about a little bit more about self-acceptance. I don't know what it is. But until you translate the ideas you heard from Chuck today into your daily work and life, nothing's going to change. And I hope that you will do that. And Chuck, thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure to have you. Glad that we were able to make this happen.
Thanks, Kevin. Really enjoyed it. A great conversation. Really hope your audience got something out of it. And I really enjoyed meeting with you. Thank you.
And well, everybody, whether you were here live or you're watching this or listening to this later on the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, we'll be back next week. So wherever you're watching or listening, make sure you come back for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Have a great day, everybody.